Hello. Welcome to the Beyond Earth Founders Roundtable. My name is Tony DiTora, and I'm your moderator for the day. So the Beyond Earth Institute is a nonprofit organization, and we're founded in part because the founders you see before us had a vision of a future with people living and working beyond planet Earth. And we thought to ourselves, how should that vision play out? We believe that those communities should be economically vibrant. We believe that those communities should be self-governing. And we believe that there is a lot of legal and policy work that needs to be done now, or that can be done now, to facilitate that, to bring us there. So we created this organization with the mission to create and sustain that legal and policy framework to help the space industry and people all around the world to rise to even greater heights than they can imagine and create these communities beyond Earth. So we'll get into a little bit of the detail of how we were founded, how Steve lassoed us all in, and but how each of us took our own journey to get to where we are. So I myself got involved in space after accidentally finding the book by Andrew Chaikin about the Apollo program. It was about this thick. It was misfiled under the Shakespeare. And it led me on my journey on the path that got me here. So, but I was on the Hill, and folks came in and said, back in the 80s, they passed this legislation about space settlement, and we'd like you to talk to your boss about reintroducing it. And that kind of led me to the policy idea of space settlement as a concept, and brought me right in here. So I'm going to Steve Wolfe. He's one of our co-founders as well. And Steve was sort of the impetus of getting us all together to begin with. So Steve, why don't you go into a little bit of that?
Yeah, and hi everyone. Great to be here. I just first want to say thank you to Tony for recommending this forum for the four of us, the main founders of Beyond Earth, to get together and chat this way and share our thinking with you directly. We'll in the future we'll have programs where we have people like Michael Gold and Tori Bruno again, but this is kind of an intimate chat. We're looking forward to having a good conversation. As Tony said, my career goes back to the 1980s where I worked on Capitol Hill, and I came to Capitol Hill with the idea of wanting to do space policy, because I'd gotten the bug really when I was very, very young, and worked space policy for a number of years and said, and came to a conclusion, is there something else that we could do to move the space settlement dream along? And that's where I conceived the idea of the Space Settlement Act of 1988, which really for the first time was congressional acknowledgement that our society was on the path to become a spacefaring civilization that includes space settlement of the solar system, and that was a good thing. Fortunately, I had a boss, Congressman George Brown, who agreed with that, and it became law and created, I think, quite a bit of excitement. It's been a bunch of years, over 3 decades since then. I think it's really time now to take that very seriously. So much has happened, especially in the last 10 years, that now we are really at the cusp, really at the brink of making this transition. And during those years since I was on the Hill, I really developed a philosophical viewpoint that recognized that humankind is very much the agent that will carry the seeds of life from this planet out into other planetary shores. And so, certainly, if you want to read about this, it's in my book. I think it's called The Obligation. So, and let me leave it there as far as my introduction. We'll be talking a lot more about Beyond Earth and what we're doing.
All right. Well, very good. So now I'm going to introduce Tom Morata over here, who is another one of our co-founders, obviously, since it's the Founders Roundtable. And so Tom is one of those people who came to my office and asked me, hey, would your boss consider introducing this legislation. My boss, Dana Rohrbacher, was actually mentored a little bit by Steve's boss, George Brown, because they were both California members interested in science, space, and technology. So that's an interesting link. But Tom, why don't you go ahead and tell us about your journey in?
Sure. Thanks, Tony. Yeah. So, like many people watching this podcast or this webcast today, lifelong space enthusiast, lifelong fan of the idea of humanity going out to space, and for my entire life, not only did I observe, but I had this desire to do something, to actually contribute, however I could, to helping bring humanity, and as Steve said, bring life to space, to the stars. And Tony mentioned that before I had my current position, I'm lucky enough and blessed enough to work in the aerospace industry today. But before that, I did volunteering and advocacy work, and that really opened my eyes and got me excited about space policy as a means to fulfill the vision of people living and working in space in large numbers. The engineering and the technology, of course, is essential and very exciting, but the policy and the legal and policy framework is also very enabling. And so that's what brought me, when Steve approached me and said, hey, we want to build this think tank focused exclusively on communities beyond Earth, exclusively on getting more people living and working in space and laying the groundwork for it. I was all in. I was very excited. And so we've had these wonderful research projects and webinars so far. But I'm really excited for this kind of more informal sort of fireside chat discussion we're going to have today. So the public can kind of get an idea of where we're going to go with this group.
Okay, very good. So Tom and I both work in the Washington, D.C. area currently. You heard Steve talk about his time on the Hill. And Sean, although he does have time on the Hill, because you can't, be in this group without it, I guess. But Sean went back to the States, and he had a lot of involvement in corporate law as well as state government. And it gives an interesting viewpoint on a lot of times we talk about these conversations. Sean, why don't you talk a little bit about how you got involved?
Absolutely. And just like you said before, Tony, the person who had the lasso the whole time was Steve Wolfe. And of course, he lassoed me in too. It happened to be almost 2 decades ago now. And I'll never forget that first phone call I had with Steve Wolfe, where he said, we don't get too many people like you reaching out to us to do a space policy project. Because at that time, I was doing corporate litigation. And, I was out of law school. I was working at a large firm. And Steve said, there's something for your perspective here. And that's really the perspective that I've tried to bring to Beyond Earth, because, I really do look at this organization as Beyond Earth being beyond us, right? Beyond us. And one of the main pieces of this is, how can we bring in all of government, right? And what can we learn from some of these subnational governments? And quite frankly, the responsibilities of these subnational governments, if we are to build a future that involves self-governance as part of these Beyond Earth communities beyond Earth, we have to look at the subnational governments. And let's face it, there's a lot that states and municipalities can learn about space policy. I've had personal experience where people have said to me, wait, outer space? Are you talking to us about outer space? I mean, that's a reaction you sometimes get. And they say, and there's a lot to learn on the economic development side for a lot of these subnational governments, but there's a lot that Beyond Earth can learn in order to develop some of these policy issues that we want to propel humanity forward. And so I'm so excited that Steve brought us in and brought me in, just like Tom, lifelong fan, lifelong passion. And now, we're at a point where we get to use all of this skill and different, experience to move humanity forward. So it's been a great experience so far. I'm so excited to our next step together.
That's great, Sean. Thank you. And I just recall back more than 20 years ago when I started lobbying for commercial space legislation. And the first response I would always get is, oh, yes, we need more office space. So, like, okay, well, I have to reword this. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But Steve, we've mentioned that you had the lasso. So, why don't you talk about last year and the organizing event that you put together for all of us and 90 other people?
So yeah, it's been an interesting road leading up to last year when we first all got together. And I had recognized for some time that there was really a gap in terms of how people thought about space policy as it related to communities beyond Earth or space settlement. For the audience, though, when we say communities beyond Earth, we're essentially talking about space settlement. We are intentionally moving away from that language for obvious reasons, and I think Tom's going to talk a little bit more about that later. But anyway, there was a gap, right? There was a gap in discussing what policies do we need that relate specifically to creating communities beyond Earth. We've been really good about near-term things. How do we build up the commercial space sector, the low Earth orbit? We're going to get back to the moon and put some more footprints there, and that's exciting. But what happens after that? And that's really the thinking here, and that's what really starts to set us apart from other kinds of space policy organizations that are addressing, because we want to look at those things that are beyond that. And I think there's precedent for that throughout society. When people talk about trying to eradicate extreme hunger or the racial divide, these are huge issues. But people are willing to tackle those issues, and we're willing to tackle this notion that we are becoming a spacefaring civilization. We are expanding out and beyond Earth, and eventually become and migrating there. So a good point to bring up, time to bring up our slides, our vision, let me, this thinking of before we get to this vision statement, but leave it up there, that's fine. It was about a year and a half ago, I said, okay, well, to kickstart this effort, let's have a symposium. Let me organize a symposium. And I was fortunate that NSS was willing to host this event at the last year's ISDC in Washington. We had a day of sessions. I had no trouble filling 20 slots on that program, dealing with issues of property rights and financing of space and governance issues and international treaty discussions all around communities beyond Earth. And out of that meeting came my three compatriots, and we began saying, how do we take this conversation further? And as a result, we decided to go ahead and form the Beyond Earth Institute with the simple vision of economically vibrant communities of people living and working beyond planet Earth for the benefit of all humankind, and a very specific mission of to create and sustain a legal and policy framework that enables economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. So quite simply, yeah. And if anyone wants to jump in on that, by all means.
So Steve, that session last year, I mean, we had 90 people in the room, and they were paying attention. They were involved and engaged all day. And I know that when Dana introduced the legislation, we had a hard time getting people to actually talk about space settlement. Now, I had to add the words exploration and development as well to the title to even get people to think about it and talk about it. Did you have that same experience back in 1988?
Well, interesting. Yes, we had there. Well, it was a mixture. When I first drafted that legislation, first I didn't think my boss was going to go for it, and he did. And he said, but you've got to take this around to all the policy people. You got to go to the committee chair, committee staff. You got to go to NASA. You got to go.
Mm-hmm.
And the remarkable thing was, for the most part, people were excited, even back then, the people that we're talking to, and people that, people that we know, like Marcia Smith, Alan Ladwig, Alan Ladwig was at NASA at the time. He could not have been more ecstatic. Marcia Smith encouraged me to change the title of the bill. I didn't go along with that. I felt we needed to say space settlement, but she provided a lot of good information. So yeah, and the same thing with the program. It was so easy for people. It's amazing how people were really riveted. 90 people did not move. I don't know what you guys thought. You guys were participated as well.
Steve, I got to tell you, I mean, you could not think about these days, trying to get 90 people to sit in a room all day, all day. And then when the session is over, how many people usually make exits, want to get first in line, get their meal, whatever? You could not get people out of the room even after it was over. The enthusiasm was just out of this world. No pun intended, but Steve, phenomenal.
I think that gives an impression that it is okay to talk about this now, which kind of leads us into our first paper, which was, we interviewed a number of people. Tom, why don't you get into that a little bit more?
I'd like to talk a little bit about the transition from that event at the National Space Society conference to the first paper. And we realized there was a lot of enthusiasm as a result of the event. We formed the Beyond Earth Institute. And on the slide here, this is kind of what we do. And it's all listed out there. And by the way, I want to recognize Brian Versteeg for that's his imagery there, spacehabs.com. So thank you, Brian, for that. But getting back to the idea, so we had this group, we had some things we wanted to do there, but then we had to get down to brass tacks and say, what are we going to do? What research shall we create? And we knew from the very beginning that we wanted our research to bridge the gap from the very high-minded, visionary ideals to actionable recommendations. Right? We wanted anybody reading our papers to be able to take policy recommendations that could be put into place, put into action today, that will lead to communities beyond Earth over the long term. So that was and is a guiding framework for all of our research. So everything that we do there, we always try to have policy recommendations that are practical, data-driven, sober, and pragmatic and actionable today. And so we had that first paper. It's funny, my experience is very different from what Tony and Steve mentioned. In my experience prior to, say, the last 3 or 4 years, if you went and spoke to somebody and said, hey, I'm interested in people living in space, they kind of smirked and they kind of said, oh, that's cute.
The giggle factor.
There was a little bit of a giggle factor. And so when we went out and did this paper, and I'll talk a little bit more later about exactly how we did it, but I just want to say, I went out to some pretty serious folks. We interviewed some very, very competent professional people. And I kind of had to apologetically say, look, we're hoping to talk about people living in space. And I thought I would get the smirk and I would get the kind of giggle. And I did not. They said, thank you. They were grateful. And they said, finally, there's a group that's tackling this head on in a data-driven way, in a very pragmatic way. And we got a great response. So I think as a society, we've kind of turned the table with all the investment happening, with all the attention that the commercial industry is putting on establishing communities beyond Earth. It's okay now to talk about it. It's okay to get involved. It's becoming normalized, so to say. So that was a big takeaway from the paper. And so we knew we had to make it Beyond Earth Institute an enduring organization. And I think Sean is going to talk a little bit about about that.
Well, I think and also, Brett, the next slide I think shows the lists of folks that Tom's talking about, right?
Right.
This is really a who's who. You see Greg Autry, who's about to be sworn in, with a little luck. I don't know what the status is right now, but he was nominated to be the chief science officer. There's, of course, Pete Warden, really just a stellar group of individuals. And this isn't even, there actually were a few other people.
That's a partial list, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, these people, these ladies and gentlemen are building the future, right? They're working in government, they're working in private industry, and they have worked in the aerospace industry for decades. And so they're very serious, very accomplished, very competent people. And they are enthusiastic about the Beyond Earth vision and mission. And actually, as a result of the research paper, Steve, many of these people went on to become advisors of Beyond Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did they want to be interviewed for our research and contribute in that manner, but they said, "Hey, we want to really get even more involved in what you're doing here." So the enthusiasm was very encouraging and very exciing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you see, it's lots of the same faces and names there.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
Yeah. No, and look, Tom, that great research and the enthusiasm that came out of it made it obvious that not only did we want to continue putting forth, as you mentioned, an enduring structure for our research, but we also wanted to try to approach things a little differently from, the traditional think tanks. Somebody thinks of this walled garden, right? They think of this opaque kind of mysterious way that research gets done, and we said we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that our process is transparent, that we show you who we're talking to, where we're getting some thoughts from. We want to welcome more ideas into this, and we're going to have methodologies that are transparent, that are obvious. Everybody knows where we're coming from. There's not going to be some mysteriousness on where we're coming up with these great ideas. Everyone's going to know. Data driven, focused on the mission of moving humanity forward, and that's going to make us different from some of these other traditional groups where you just kind of don't know exactly where some of these ideas are coming from. It's going to be right out there for all to see. And so, Tom, that's thanks to your great work right there.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something. Tom, one of the things you mentioned was actionable today. And a lot of the policies we're talking about have long legs and will reach out to whenever these communities beyond Earth are actually created, which, we actually ask all of our webinar guests to tell us when they think they'll see the first community beyond Earth. Anybody who's sharing can put it in the comments or send us a tweet or what have you to tell us when you think we'll see the first community beyond Earth. But the policy recommendations that came out of that paper and that we are moving forward, are actions today that can lead to that. So they're important today.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we in the course of doing the research, we interviewed the people that you saw on the slide earlier, and others. There were other people that we interviewed who asked not to be included in the report, but did give us off the record feedback. And their recommendations on how to implement sort of a path to communities beyond Earth was pretty diverse. It spanned the gamut, and if you dig into the report, covers a lot of ground. But the three recommendations there were commonly held by almost all, if not all, of the respondents. And you'll see they're very relevant to today. Revamping the arms and export control regime, not only to help U.S. commercial development, but to help international collaboration towards communities beyond Earth. Voluntary norms of behavior. This is something is very a great opportunity for industry and for non-governmental organizations to sort of push the ball down the field, so to speak, if I could use an American football analogy, without having to wait for government action. And then thirdly, thinking of government action, looking towards the precedent of perhaps the International Space Station, the Intergovernmental Agreement, and doing something similar to develop space with an eye towards permanence and permanent communities beyond Earth, embracing the sort of wonderful precedent, like I said, of nations working together in space to build the space stations. Well, why not explore doing it again for communities beyond Earth? Very ambitious, but still not unprecedented and achievable today.
But one of the other things that came out of that out of those interviews, is the terminology, settlements, colonies, and as Steve mentioned earlier, there's a lot of baggage with those types of terms. So Steve Hurley, I see a comment right down here, depends on how you define a community. And that's what we did. We defined a community beyond Earth. So what are the elements of a community beyond Earth? Self-governing,
right?
Economically vibrant,
right?
People beyond Earth. So,
yeah.
And what are our thoughts about the definition and coming up with it?
So I think it's important first to point out what our definition does not say, right? We don't choose a definition, a destination, right? We don't say it needs to be on a particular celestial body. It just needs to be beyond Earth. So it needs to be in space somewhere. We are, or at least I, and I think we, as the Beyond Earth Institute, are destination agnostic. We're not going to advocate for a certain, celestial body that we ought to go to.
Yep.
The other thing that I'll point out from this definition is it's pretty provocative, and that's by design. I've received a lot of feedback from people in the space community, very, very vocal feedback, arguing with me about this. And that's great. I want to see more of that. Thank you for that. You see my Twitter handle there. You can send us an email at contact us on the contact us page of beyondearth.org. But we put this definition out there with a hope of spurring more discussion and to put out, it's also aspirational. We hope that this is what communities beyond Earth will look like. And so, I mean, Steve, have you gotten any feedback about that?
I'll just add that, it is aspirational. And the feedback, of course, we've gotten is that, I've heard people say that, well, why can't we just put 10 people in a free-flying habitat, and why can't we just call that, declare that they're the nation of, whatever, and in space, and declare it a colony now. And I think and maybe you could do that, maybe that would be okay if 10 people wanted to live that way. But I think to your point on aspirational, right? So we want to do this in a way that's sustainable. And right, that's sort of the watchword now anyway in space development. How do we do it in a way that's sustainable? And certainly when we actually do begin to engage creating these habitats, we want them to be robust. We want them to have a degree of self-governance. We want them to be economically viable, and so forth.
Absolutely.
Right.
And just taking this definition on, like right away, put us in a new position. As Tom mentioned, we want people to engage with us on this because we know this needs to be done, right? We know that this needs to be done. We know this work needs to be done, and we need to put forward what, in our informed opinion, will be that enduring aspect that Steve is talking about, and moving to the next level. So again, that's why we're pursuing this, and we hope that you take advantage of, as I'm speaking, we hope you take advantage of Tom's Twitter handle.
I see some,
barrage him with comments.
Yeah, sure, go nuts. That's what Twitter's for. I see some comments over here. Speaking of social media and comments, our policy papers, for those who are looking to read them, are on our website, beyondearth.org, under the Policy Resources tab. And so our paper describing those 3 recommendations in more detail and the methodology, as well as our defining Communities Beyond Earth paper are both available there. And I also see some comments there about discussing self-governing, and Sean, maybe there are different levels of self-governing. There's There's the idea of completely independent, and then there's various flavors or levels of self-governing, and maybe we could kind of talk a little bit about that, because it doesn't necessarily mean a complete independence, cut off from Earth.
Right. Well, and look, what Beyond Earth is trying to do, and some of my research is going into this, is we have to address kind of the first question about the enforcement mechanism, right? Of how we approach it, because you have self-governance. That means that you have a community of people who are agreeing to be governed, right? And to be governed means that there's an enforcement mechanism that community has consented to, right? And consent can be tricky. I don't want to legalize this, but that's why my research is looking into what are some of the mechanisms we have on Earth that are well established, already in use, generally agreed upon, and that we can translate into some of these communities beyond Earth. And one of those areas, and again, this is research that is ongoing, so will be established, is potentially using a form of arbitration system, at least initially, because that is one area where we have a lot of corporate experience with using this as an enforcement mechanism. Parties agree ahead of time to be bound by a certain set of arbitrators, and they rely on their opinions. They trust their opinions in most cases, right? Losers always have a complaint about the opinion of the person that said no, but that's just the name of the game. But there is a lot where we could work with there. We have experience, terrestrial experience. We're not talking here about reinventing everything, but it is one area where you can actually get private entities to agree to be bound with using a mechanism already on Earth, and that could potentially pave the way forward, especially maybe in some of these initial communities. So again, exciting area of research. I'm looking forward to having more conversations about this and reaching at least a destination that we can point to as what might be the best way to get to self-governance. But we have to answer that enforcement question first and foremost.
Enforcement, yeah, and that's a nice preview for future research. When I see we have some slides up there, but when we were making the definition paper internally, we had a big debate about economically vibrant, and Tony, I'm going to kind of throw a curveball in your direction,
okay.
But if you, I don't know if you feel comfortable kind of spitballing a little and describing your vision of economically vibrant, and what, like we talked about self-governing, and we're going to have more on that in the future from Beyond Earth Institute. But there's some comments in the comments here about it. Does it require financial support from Earth? Is it complete independence?
Sure.
What is economically vibrant? It's sort of a vague term. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think I've seen some of these comments too. I think they're great. We've got a great audience out there. And I was making a joke earlier that we needed to be about 20% more wonky, but that was before we started. But no, for economic vibrancy, you don't need to be self-sustaining to be economically vibrant. I mean, New York City is not self-sustaining. They bring in food and they bring in all sorts of other things, but they have an economy and they produce goods and services and they send that to other places and they get food back in. So vibrancy means that you're growing, you're sustaining, you're able to reach into new marketplaces with whatever the goods and services are that you're providing. And there is some sort of mechanism or something that is driving new goods and services that you're exploring and trying to figure out, are these viable or not? So, things fail all the time, but but it doesn't need to be self-sustaining in and of itself. That's kind of what Steve was alluding to earlier. You get a group of 10 people who's got a little farm and it's a little commune type system and they don't want anything to do with anybody. That's fine, but that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're interested in seeing. And so
the national models are the same thing on Earth. I mean, no country is unto itself. We're interconnected global economy, and that'll continue in space. Any economy that develops in space will continue to be interconnected with the U.S. I mean, maybe eventually, Martian colonies will expand, will grow into cities and continents, and activities that if they needed to, they wouldn't have to trade with Earth, and that would be fine. But there's going to be, we're going to be interconnected economically into the future. Although you do need the economic drivers for any community beyond Earth initiative, even if it's just selling condos, on that.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Steve.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the other things I was going to touch back on was the voluntary norms of behavior, which is one of the recommendations that came out of those conversations, the first part, and it feeds right into the arbitration if everybody's agreeing to operate a certain way. And I think, Brett, you had the other slide with the first webinar that we had with those heads. Yeah, so we had Mike Gold on talking about the Artemis Accords, which are, in essence, voluntary norms of behavior among nations.
Right.
So that's great. It's not a treaty, but everybody's agreeing to operate under those norms. And now, as we look to the future, how are other people going to engage themselves? Elon Musk said a group of people on Mars, they're going to be self-governing. And, he got some pushback on that, but it's a conversation that's happening. And let's have that discussion and get into those details, do the research and see what's out there. And that's something we're working on behind the scenes here. And we'll bring it out when we're through with our vetting process, as it were.
No, you should see, your comment about Elon Musk's comment on Mars, and when we talk about space settlement or communities beyond Earth being so far in the future, it's really upon us, right? Because we do need to call out Elon and Jeff Bezos, who are really very much driving this discussion, are really helping to move it forward. And do we simply, the question, do we simply let Elon do what he's going to do? But is there a role for policy so that as all of this unfolds, it unfolds in a way that is most equitable and actually can accelerate for the greatest participation of the greatest participation of the greatest population that it can.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And whatever happens soon sets precedent. Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, you're absolutely right. And Steve, one of your comments inspired me and said, first of all, yes, we need to give credit where credit is due for the entrepreneurs who are pushing out there like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. But, I also want to recognize the groups that have been doing it for decades, like the National Space Society and the Space Frontier Foundation, that have been doing advocacy work for a long time. I mean, we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants in a lot of ways in that respect. But I want to kind of do a flip on the idea of this vision. We have this vision of a positive vision of economically vibrant, kind of this like shiny, happy future. As Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and others move out into space and hopefully bring lots of people with them, we have a choice, right? Do we continue the mistakes of the past? Do we want to have a future in space that looks a lot like our history, for better or worse? Or do we want to do things differently? And the technology is one question, and the entrepreneurs are going to solve that problem eventually, given enough time and money. But the policy, how people live in space and the quality of their life and the opportunities afforded to them and their rights and so on and so forth, how they live their life will be determined by policy. And there's not billions of dollars going towards that. There's not thousands of people at, multi-billion-dollar organizations doing that yet. Right. So that's part of the reason why we're here, is we want to create a future that's positive from a social and legal and regulatory perspective as well.
If I may, Tom, getting on to piggybacking on your point there, right? There is also a choice to not do anything, right? Like the absence of policy is also a choice. And that's one of the dangers I think we see as an organization, which is why Steve lassoed us together, is to say, if we're just going to focus on the next few years, we're suddenly going to end up in a position where we have an absence of policy, right? And Beyond Earth is filling that gap, filling that policy gap to say, all right, we kind of know where this is going, and we actually can't afford to make a choice to not do something, right? Because that could have consequences that we don't necessarily want to see, and may threaten an enduring presence, an enduring human presence in space. So that's one of the challenges I think we're trying to address, and we're looking at innovative solutions to get there. Solutions that, you know, people who are driving the healthy competition that could take us further than we've ever gone before. Well, we want to use drivers that obviously will not impede that, right? That healthy competition, but also allows for, you know, at least knowing some of I don't even call them rules, but some of the norms of the road, you know, and how we're getting to that destination. So it's great. It's a great journey, and that's why, you know, I again commend Steve for bringing, you know, his vision together to put this organization in that position to help make it happen.
Well, Sean, if I could, we were talking about arbitration. When we were talking the other day, you had a great example to sort of contextualize what you meant by that, and how that, you know, how your research has can have a real world example.
Right, Steve. And look, one of the challenges that we have is right now we kind of know if something happens in low Earth orbit, we kind of have a pretty good sense of where we can get things enforced if we have to, right? We have to make a contract on Earth. We have to, you know, get a launch license on Earth. Maybe we have a satellite that we're concerned about that transmitting information to Earth, right? There's stuff that can be done to, you know, have these enforcement mechanisms. But once we get outside of low Earth orbit, you know, then what if you have an issue with maybe the habitat that you've decided to make? Maybe it's not an issue with the habitat, or maybe it's an issue with, you know, some of the materials that you've used. In space, you're on a habitat. You're not in a position to necessarily go to a court on Earth, right? And which court would you go to is a whole other question, right? Let's just presume the United States, and litigate your claim or do some other enforcement, right? You're not gonna be able to do it. You're in a position where I really believe that if we don't settle this question of what happens in that position, what happens when there's a dispute, you know, far away from earthly courts and lawyers. And by the way, those space lawyers are going to charge a lot, right? That you're going to impede this development, because people are not going to want to make the investment without having a little bit of certainty how to address that situation. And that's where an arbitration system comes in, when you have a pool of experts already knowledgeable, already trusted ahead of time to resolve these types of questions when you're there on location, right? So I think that's one of the things that we're really excited about, to see where this research goes in addressing that challenge.
Hey, Steve. I see we have a bunch of questions, and there's one question that I saw from Michael Mealing. If there were several hundred semi-wealthy people who wanted to be settlers, right? Thank you, Brett. If you wanted to be settlers now, what are their options? And I think that's a great segue to, you know, we've been talking about future research, future projects that we're going to have, and Sean mentioned this arbitration idea and this idea of dispute resolution, and how do we enforce contracts in space and far away. Steve, maybe you could mention a little bit about your human space sector report, because that's kind of about, you know, Michael's question and the research that you're proposing with that are about the here and now today. What is the state of communities beyond Earth today? If I'm a settler to be, okay, where do I go? Where do I sign up? How
Right.
can I do that?
Well, That's a good question. Thank you, Michael, for that question. Obviously, you can't just buy a ticket to go to a space settlement, but you can buy a ticket to take a ride in space. Virgin Galactic is about to start taking people up to the edge of the atmosphere for suborbital flights. Very soon, we're going to see SpaceX and Blue Origin doing the same thing. Axiom will sell you a ticket to go to the space station and spend some time there for a cheap ticket of $55 million. And so your wealthy groups could take advantage of that. But I think there will be a time, and I was only, this idea of selling condos on a space habitat. I was only half joking. I mean, there are people that have crunched the numbers and have come up with, have shown that that's a viable model, as opposed to, say, mining operations or solar power satellite construction, these other kinds of drivers that people typically talk about. But let me, to your point, Tom, talk about areas of research, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do. The next slide, Brett, we want to come back to infrastructure. But the one thing that I'm personally working on is a report that looks at humans in space, right? So what is the market? How much money is being spent on humans in space? So, for example, we're seeing with the advent of Virgin Galactic and other models for sending humans in space, they're estimating that space tourism, for example, is going to be $3 billion. NASA spends over $3 billion a year just on the ISS. The Artemis program, sending people back to the moon, is going to peak out at $12 billion a year. It's probably going to be more than that. And so, how do we really want to track the impact on our economy of humans being and living, working, and playing in space, because that's sort of core to our mission. So we've seen the statistics of the space industry as a whole. Right now, it's approaching $400 billion, which is great. That's largely satellite communications or the satellite industry. We want to look at that subset that's just about the humans, right? How many humans are we sending up every year? Well, right now it's just whoever's going up to the space station. Well, and soon it may be how many people are going to the moon. What are the numbers? So we want to be looking at that curve, right? And we want to look at the trends. What are the expectations in the out years, in 10 years, and 20 years? So we want to look at the expectations, what's on the books, what is being planned. So it's not pure speculation. So
Steve, we also want to see where they're coming from, right?
With this, well, I'm sorry, I am going on a bit too long, but with this data, that's going to inform a lot about what we're doing. It's also showing that this is a real vibrant industry that in and of itself that's emerging. Tourism is a piece of that, but it's a broader discussions of humans in space, government versus private, U.S. versus international. So there's all of these parameters that we want to look at and begin to create metrics.
While at the same time, though, in my opinion, there's a lot of marketing and excitement language in the space industry, especially the commercial space industry. So with this research, it is my hope that we're trying to be as clear-eyed and as neutral as possible in order to give the public and stakeholders and observers and perhaps even investors and others who are interested in moving into the space industry kind of some a neutral set of data, sort of a very well researched. We're not the space station company predicting 1,000 space stations 5 years from now, right? You know, we are really taking a hard eye looking, and hopefully that curve you mentioned, Steve, is curving up. But, you know, if the data shows that maybe it's leveling off or even curving down, well, we'll go ahead and say that too. We want our report. It's not going to be a cheerleading report. It's not going to be an advocacy report. It will be a true research report on human activity in space over the next 5, 10, maybe even longer years. It's hard to get data much further out than that.
So one of the pieces here that we haven't really, that I was trying to bring up there was, if most of the people in space are representatives of the governments they're with, then that looks like a different, you know, regulatory or legal situation than if most of the people are not. If they're operating as representatives of individual companies or just on their own recognizance. So the question then becomes, how do those people interact? And that's getting more towards the governance structures in these communities beyond Earth and the sense of arbitration. And I see that some conversation going on with Nancy and Michael on the chat there about governance structures. And is our idea to create a governance structure for communities beyond Earth that'll apply to all of them? It's not. We're looking broadly and enabling whatever the communities beyond Earth want as their governing structure. And it'll be different from community to community. And as Michael points out, it'll develop based upon the problems that they see. So we're focused on policies and legal questions on the Earth now that will enable these communities to be built and developed and grow in the future. So anybody like to touch on that a little bit more, or that's good?
No, I think it's a good question. I think we obviously, I think when we are talking about governance, self-governance is important, right? So self-governance means we're not telling them how to govern themselves, although we expect that they will behave in accordance to certain international norms with regards to human rights and these kinds of things, so that they're. So I don't think that just because someone leaves planet Earth, they leave their right to humanity behind them. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do there.
Right, and look, that's one of the challenges that we've been kicking around now for a little while with the difference between substance, right? What are the substantive ideas that we're trying to codify versus the structures, the enforcement mechanisms, right? The biggest impediment to humans beyond Earth are humans, and where humans go, conflict follows, right? Like this is humanity, right? That's the biggest impediment, is that we're bringing other humans with us, and so we have to have these enforcement mechanisms, these conflict resolution procedures, really established. Otherwise, if we figure out when we might actually have one of these communities beyond Earth, like we don't want to have an end date. Well, we've set the date where you're landing, but here's the date where you may not be around anymore because you didn't develop these mechanisms ahead of time, and that's what we're trying to prevent by thinking this far ahead. So, I'm really excited about all this work that we're doing, and how we're going to really move this whole conversation forward into the future.
You can't leave human nature on Earth, huh? So
Pretty good. Pretty good.
All right, so we're rapidly running out of time. So I've seen some of the predictions that our audience has been making about the first community beyond Earth. It's ranged anywhere from, I think, 15 years up to 50 years or more. And let's go around and ask the founders what they think. Who should we start with? Steve, do you want to start?
Okay. Yes. This is a hard question. Actually, I found this to be a hard question. So I only just really tried to wrap my head around it, but this morning, and I'm going to say,
Steve, you're the boss. You could punt if you want. You can,
no, I would not do that. I would not.
Tom's working on it. He's going to say Tom's working on it.
That's Tom's job. No, no. I'm going to say 2048, which is
2048.
I think is pretty ambitious.
Mm-hmm.
And and it is the Musk factor. I'm going to call it the Musk factor, because when you showed that slide earlier from our previous webinar with Pete Warden, Mike Gold, and Michelle Hanlon. And if you recall, there it is.
Laura Montgomery.
Laura Montgomery, yeah. If you recall that Pete said he expected a human colony in space within 10 years.
Yep.
Because he knows something about his friends in Silicon Valley, which we haven't been able to get him to tell us what that is fully, but I'm very curious about that.
We all are. Okay.
What I'll do is
2048.
Elon is always late, right? But he's never that late. So I'm gonna take 10 years. I'm gonna add 18 years onto that.
Gotcha. Okay. So Sean, what do you got for?
Well, I'm gonna undercut Steve with the 2045. Okay. I'm gonna be 3 years more optimistic. 2045.
Cool.
Great, Tom. Okay.
So this is kind of slightly disappointing, but I'm also going to choose 2045. But I have some analysis, right? I have some thinking behind this. So stick with me while we go through this. So during this decade, the 2020s, it'll be the R&D decade for commercial space stations. In that, we're going to learn how to operate commercial space stations. We already know how to survive in space and live in space with the ISS. And also in this decade, we're going to find the killer app, right? We're going to figure out what product or what service has to be made in space on space stations that has a huge market back on Earth. And so starting in the 2030s, we're going to see an absolute wonderful increase in the number of space stations, not only in low Earth orbit, but throughout cislunar space. And they're going to be manufacturing this killer app and servicing that manufacturing base. And we're going to see hundreds, if not thousands of people throughout the 2030s. And I'm going to even go so far as to say we're going to see the first baby born in space in the 2030s on one of those space stations.
You heard it here. You heard it here.
Wow.
That's right. Pete Warden, eat your heart out.
Tom, just to show you how political minded I am, when you said R&D decade, I thought Republicans and Democrats.
No.
Trying to figure out what you were saying.
We'll
That's
need
just
conflict resolution.
No,
my apologies to everyone.
Republican and Democrats.
So my thinking is that 30 years is not isn't appropriate to and I know it's a round number and everything else, but I'm going to go with 30 years, which would make it 2050, which would make me the most pessimistic person on the panel today. So that's okay. So
I hope we're all wrong.
You heard me mention Brett earlier, and Brett is part of the Beyond Earth team. So Brett Jones, he also has a book, by the way, Shock and Awe Recruit, and so you should all go out and read that. So Brett's date was 2045 as well. Thank you for that, Brett. And then we also have David Bullock, who is also part of our team. We couldn't have done the event without David and without Brett. So David said 2040 for his date, which makes him even more optimistic than most of the crowd.
Optimist.
David also has a book, 2008-2018, A New Space Primer. So did I miss anybody's books? I think Tom and Steve both mentioned their own, so that's okay.
I didn't mention my book, The High Frontier and Easier Way. The High Frontier and Easier Way, and my co-author, Al Globus. I'll give a hat tip to him.
And there's Al right there on the screen. So, all right, it's time to wrap it up. Steve, would you like to say any final thoughts? And as president of the Beyond Earth Institute, what makes us important there?
Yeah, no, I want to thank you guys. The one thing I think that I had in a note earlier is just to say that, we want to tip our hats to what came before with the National Space Society, Space Frontier Foundation. Those are advocacy groups, and I think we're a lot of things, but we're not an advocacy group. What we want is for those organizations, we want to be providing those organizations with real valuable content that they can use and take to Congress and to advocate for and so forth. So that's our objective. I do want to thank that we do have a couple of interns this year. Paras Adlaka and Sai Sankirth, who has been working with us. Paras did say that his prediction was 2033, to throw that out. And Tom, you're working with Sai, so I'll let you tell his. But anyway, we just scratched the surface here today. There's so much going on. We really want to encourage you to come to the website, sign up, and be part of this. There are a lot of ways to be an active participant in what we're doing. I'll just leave it there. Thanks, Tony. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. And Sai's prediction was 2040.
There you
And
go.
I'll just one more time plug our website. Contact us. You guys see our Twitter handles there.
Yep.
And thanks for the exciting conversation in the chat. This is great.
Absolutely.
Great to see that kind of engagement. All right. Thank you all.